Now, the idea of lost or disoriented souls wandering in a sort of a stunned, confused state after death, that is an extremely well-documented phenomena in afterlife research. So while popular culture often refers to them as earthbound spirits or ghosts, several prominent researchers have cataloged these states through near-death experiences, NDEs, and hypnotic regressions. So let's go through those because these are really biggies. First, let's talk about Raymond Moody. And in his great work, The Realm of Bewildered Spirits, Dr. Raymond Moody, the psychiatrist who coined the term near-death experience, did not write much about distressing or confusing states in his first book, Life After Life. Okay? Oh, and in that first book, Life After Life, is a 1975 book. And that focused primarily on positive, peaceful transitions. However, after collecting far more cases, he addressed this directly in his 1977 sequel, which is Reflections on Life After Life. That's the second book. Now, Moody identified a very specific, less common region of the NDE, or near-death experience transition, that he termed the realm of bewildered spirits. So let's go through those. It's in the state of the souls. Moody described these spirits as dulled, oblivious, and seemingly trapped in a limbo-like state of existence. They did not know who they were or what had happened to them. This is really important, folks. Listen. And then he described the cause of the bewilderment. So according to Moody's subjects, these souls were completely unable to surrender their attachments to the physical world. And the earthbound connection, Moody wrote, this is a quote from Moody, they seemed bound to some particular object, person, or habit. Their God is still living here. Well, they were effectively trapped between the physical and the spiritual worlds, unwilling or unable to move on to the next phase of their journey. Okay? Raymond Moody. Now, let's go to Dolores Cannon. Here we develop the subject of earthbound ghosts and sudden death shock. So, Dolores Cannon is a pioneering hypnotherapist, and she specialized in past life regression and the life between lives state. And she documented these disoriented souls extensively, particularly in her book, Between Death and Life, Conversations with a Spirit. And she published that in 1993. Now, according to literally thousands of regression sessions which Cannon conducted, she talks about the trauma of sudden death. And Cannon found that souls who die suddenly or violently, such as in battle or car accidents, or by suicide, often experience a form of cognitive shock upon leaving the body. And they do not realize that they have died and are highly disoriented. So you have a state of wandering the physical plane. These disoriented souls frequently hang around the scenes of their deaths or their homes. They try to talk to living people, becoming deeply frustrated and stunned when they are ignored or when they realize their hands pass right through physical objects. Now, let's go on to the mechanism of the ghosts. Cannon explained that ghosts are simply earthbound spirits trapped in an obsessive, repetitive thought loop. They remain in this disoriented fog until they finally accept their death, look up, and perceive the guides or greeters who are waiting to lead them to healing centers in the spiritual realm. Well, there are other major researchers on disoriented souls. So several other prominent figures in afterlife and NDE, near-death experience research, they've documented similar findings. For example, there's Dr. Michael Newton, and he wrote Journey of Souls, and that was published in 1994. Now, he was a contemporary of Dolores Cannon, and Dr. Michael Newton used deep hypnotherapy to study the soul's journey, and he explicitly categorized disturbed or disoriented spirits. Now, about the displaced soul, Newton noted that younger or less spiritually mature souls who suffer traumatic deaths often wander around the physical location of their demise in a state of confusion or anger. And there's also the issue of unfinished business. These souls refuse to return to the spirit world because they are obsessively focused on a grievance, a loved one, or unfinished business. Now, Newton observed that spirit guides are eventually deployed to gently coax these disoriented souls out of their self-imposed isolation and back into the light. Okay, and then there's also Bruce Grayson and Nancy Evans Bush. Bruce Grayson and Nancy Evans Bush. And they deal with what you might call distressing NDEs, or near-death experiences. So, Dr. Bruce Grayson, he's a leading medical researcher of NDEs, along with researcher Nancy Evans Bush, and who has categorized the distressing NDEs. Okay, so while most NDEs are peaceful, a subset of experiencers report entering a dark, terrifying void. And in this void, they describe encountering other entities who are completely silent, frozen, or aimlessly wandering in absolute isolation, despair, and bewilderment, seemingly unaware of how to escape the darkness. Well, let's go to the various researchers and summarize where they are, starting with Raymond Moody. So his term for the state that these people are in after death is the realm of bewildered spirits. And he says that the core cause is extreme physical or material attachments. And that state ends with resolving the specific attachment keeping them perplexed. Okay? Now let's go to Dolores Cannon. Her term for the state is earthbound spirits or ghosts. And for her, the core cause is sudden death shock, refusal to accept physical death. And how does that state end? Realizing they are dead and accepting help from spirit guides. Okay? So now let's go on to the other researcher, which is Michael Newton. And his term for the state is disturbed, lingering souls. And the core cause that he says is trauma, immaturity, anger, or unfinished business. And how does that state end? Gentle intervention and escort by advanced spirit guides. And finally, we have Bruce Grayson, and his term for the state is unpleasant limbo, distressing void. Distressing void. And the core cause, he says, is psychological or existential resistance during the transition. And how does it end? Resuscitation for the NDEers. They're brought back to life, resuscitation on the hospital bed or whatever, or eventually surrendering to the light. Okay, so that's quite a few researchers. Now, the researchers who study these transitional states do so using very different toolkits. And the way a researcher gathers data fundamentally shapes what they see in the afterlife or transitional landscape. So when mapping out these disoriented or lost soul states, the differences between hypnotic regression and clinical near-death studies reveal two completely different vantage points of the same exact territory. So let's look at their methods. With hypnotic regression and past life therapy, the key practitioners are Dolores Cannon and Dr. Michael Newton. Now the method is using deep hypnosis, such as Cannon's quantum healing hypnosis technique or Newton's LBL protocol. So, to guide a living subject to the sort of somnambulistic state of trance. And the subject is asked to regress past their birth to their life between lives. And how this methodology maps the transition is the following. A street-level view of the afterlife. Because the subject is in a deep trance, is not under medical duress, the researcher has the luxury of time. They can ask highly specific, open-ended questions for hours. And the focus on stuck states, well, this methodology is highly effective at mapping the anomalies of transition. The souls who didn't cross over cleanly because the therapist is digging into past life traumas to resolve current life issues. They naturally uncover memories of past deaths where the soul was traumatized, stubborn, or disoriented. And we have the issue of the slow motion map. So under hypnosis, the subject can detail the exact physiological mechanics of why they stayed behind and how long they hovered over their grave and the precise moment a guide finally broke through their confusion. Now, second, let's talk about clinical and prospective near-death studies. So here the key practitioners are Raymond Moody, Dr. Bruce Grayson, and Dr. Pim van Lommel. That's Lommel. Now the method used is structured qualitative interviews and medical tracking of patients who have survived a clinical crisis, like a cardiac arrest, like a heart attack. So this often uses standardized assessment tools like the Grayson NDE scale to measure the depth of the experience. And how this methodology maps the transition is the following. First, there is the highway bypass view. Now, people who have NDEs are only dead for a few minutes before being resuscitated. So as a result, they are usually moving at high velocity through the transition. They rarely stay in the intermediate zones long enough to sort of set up camp, you might say. So they get brief glimpses, and these brief glimpses of the disoriented is very interesting. Because the NDEers are passing through quickly, they usually report the realm of bewildered spirits, as Moody termed it. As a landscape, they merely flew over or witnessed from a distance on their way to the light. They are observers. They're not participants. So let's focus on the structure. The clinical researchers use systematic comparison to map the common sequence of the journey. For example, out of body goes to the tunnel, goes to the light, goes to the life review. Now, this methodology is great at establishing these zones exist consistently across cultures, but it's less suited for lingering in the lost states. If you linger in the lost states, you can note more things. So let's focus on the various attributes and so on. Let's start with hypnotic regression, which is basically Cannon and Newton. Now, the clinical NDE studies are for Moody and Grayson. So hypnotic regression with Cannon and Newton, and the clinical NDE studies is Moody and Grayson. Okay? So let's look at the data source for these two different types. First, you get hypnotic regression. And with hypnotic regression, you get deeply hypnotized living subjects recalling their past inner life, or interlife. Their interlife, between life memories. Okay? Now, in the clinical NDE studies, you get resuscitated patients recalling a recent clinical event. Okay? Now, let's look at the perspective. With hypnotic regression, you get internal and participatory things. You get the subject experiences being a confused or earthbound soul. But in the clinical NDE studies, you get external and observational perspective. The subject passes through the boundary and witnesses other confused souls. Okay, so now let's look at the time frame map for each side. With hypnotic regression, you get long-term maps, years or decades of a soul being stuck. With the clinical NDE studies, you get a snapshot because, the person's dead only for a minute or two. And that maps a highly condensed view of minutes. Well, let's look at the scientific acceptance of these things. Now, with hypnotic regression, it's a little lower, and it's treated primarily as a therapeutic tool or a metaphysical exploration. With the clinical NDE studies, it's a little higher, peer-reviewed medical journal data tied to clinical cardiac brain arrest type of things. Well, let's look at the sort of what we might call the methodological mirror of the whole situation. With near-death studies, they show us the ideal freeway of the transition. Does everyone understand that? Near-death studies show us the ideal freeway of the transition. What happens when the soul is pulled quickly and naturally toward the light? With hypnotic regression, it acts like a traffic report, focusing on the traffic jams, the construction zones, and the souls who took the wrong exit and got lost in the dark. So let's look at the comparison. When we place the clinical findings of near-death experiences, NDE studies, alongside the metaphysical landscapes of past life regression and compare both of those to Farsight's remote viewing investigations in the death traps, into the death traps. We have two projects with the death traps. We have the death traps and the escape, those two major projects, which you really need to go see at farsightprime.com. We find a striking progression when we compare these NDE things and past life regression things with the death traps. Farsight data as follows. The data moves from a hopeful transition, which is classic NDEs, to psychological friction, the disoriented lost souls of Cannon and Newton, and finally to a systematic technological explanation of why this friction and memory loss occur. So let's focus on Farsight's remote viewing data. By synthesizing these three methodologies, which is the clinical NDE research, then the hypnotic regression, and then the blind remote viewing research, we can map out how these transitional states connect. Well, first we have the gateway, which is the light versus the net. Now, the most profound point of connection and contradiction between these various fields is the nature of the light encountered immediately after physical death. Physical death leads to the tunnel of light versus free transition. So, which one? Let's start with the tunnel of light after physical death. The NDE view is warmth, love, and peace. The Farsight view is artificial lure, trap, like flypaper, and electroshock wipe. Now, what about the free transition? Free transition gives immediate peace, retained memory, and a guide reunion. And the NDE and regression perspective, here we have Raymond Moody and Michael Newton's subjects, almost universally describe a magnetic, warm, and loving light or tunnel that draws the soul inward. And in traditional frameworks, this is viewed as the gateway to heaven or the spiritual home. But the Farsight remote viewing perspective is Farsight's viewers saw this exact same pathway of light under totally blind conditions, but perceived it as an artificial lure, essentially a metaphysical flytrap. Now, to talk about the actual remote viewers that were in these studies, Yeme Genet described a very pretty light path that felt warm, safe, and beautiful, which matches the NDE stuff. But then, she said, it then turns, it abruptly turns dark, leading to a violent high-voltage electrical storm that rattled the soul. Now, the connection. What clinical NDEs record as a comforting transition, Farsight's data frames as the intake mechanism of a planetary recycling system. Because NDE survivors are resuscitated within minutes, they only experience the entryway of the light. They rarely stay long enough to experience the secondary zapping and memory wiping phase described by both deep trance regression subjects and Farsight's blind remote viewers. So let's talk about the disoriented state. Lost souls versus zapped ISBs. Now, ISBs is the Farsight way of calling the soul. We don't use soul or spirit because of the religious baggage associated with that. We use ISBs, I-S-B-E, immortal spiritual being. Someone who is simply for the purpose of being. Okay? ISB. So, let's talk about the disoriented state. Lost souls versus zapped ISBs. So, my initial concern or focus is focused on the lost souls who wandered in a stunned or disoriented state. And I wondered, how does this compare with the Farsight stuff? So the three methodologies that we talked about map this exact state of disorientation. The exact same thing, but through different lenses. Now the regression explanation, which is Cannon and Newton, here we have Dolores Cannon and Michael Newton. They attribute the lost soul phenomenon to cognitive shock, sudden dramatic death, an intense material attachment, or a refusal to accept that the physical body has died. Now, the soul wanders because it is emotionally or psychologically stuck in a self-imposed loop. Now let's go to the Farsight thing. The Farsight remote viewing explanation is, Farsight's project suggests that this disoriented state is actually a technological byproduct of an aggressive memory erasing process. The zapping event. In the Death Traps sessions, the viewers describe souls encountering an electroshock-like event. Now, Trudy Benjamin perceived subjects, she's one of the remote viewers who participated in that one, she perceived subjects entering a state of complete blackout, where they experience amnesia, a continuous loop of post-traumatic stress, and a desperate, futile struggle to remember who they were before they died. Now let's talk about the zombie state. Kamaya Dunson, one of the other remote viewers, Kamaya Dunson described processed souls in this state as lost souls, that's what she called it, and zombies, wandering aimlessly in a purgatory-like environment, stating they are not in control of their mental state anymore because their identity has been wiped. So let's talk about the connection. The stunned and confused earthbound spirits documented by Cannon and Moody closely match the description of what Farsight calls zapped ISBs. The disorientation isn't merely a psychological reaction to dying, it's the trauma of having one's spiritual timeline and memories actively scrambled. So let's go to the third thing, which is the management idea. Guides versus AI and overseers. Who greets the soul after death? This is where the narrative takes a dramatic turn depending on the methodology used. In NDEs and the LBL regression, hypnotic regression stuff, the soul is met by benevolent guides, angels, or the classic council of elders, who review the soul's past life with them and gently suggest what they need to work on in their next reincarnation. Well, in Farsight's remote viewing, Farsight's data suggests that these guides and elders may be three-dimensional holographic projections or AI-mediated interfaces designed to enforce compliance. Now, Yeme Janae, again, she was one of the remote viewers, she noted that the good path and its maternal goddess-like energy was actually a false environment designed by shadowy interceptors who picked apart the things that made him feel good and calm to lure him in. Now, we also did a project on the maintenance of the death traps. The infrastructure, the death traps. That's a death traps maintenance project. The viewers tracked this operation to highly secure, cloaked, subterranean and mountain facilities staffed by a collaborative mix of humans, reptilians, and insectoids. They observed soul containment devices referred to as soul batteries or Object Q, where sentient energy is stored, updated, and systematically warped to erase the linear continuity of past life memories. Now, let's go to the fourth thing, which is the methodological mapping of the afterlife. If we look at how these different research methods paint the transition, we see that they are looking at the exact same sequence of events, but interpreting the raw data through different paradigm filters. So let's talk about the stages of transition. In clinical NDE studies, which again is Moody and Grayson, step 1 is the release, the out-of-body awareness, floating above the physical corpse. Now, in the hypnotic regression, which is Cannon and Newton, you get the release, which is detaching from the body, the initial confusion if death was sudden. But in the Farsight remote viewing perspective, the release is the ISB detaches from the physical wrapper, or pretty piece of meat. Okay. Now, let's go on to the clinical NDE studies again of step 2, which is the draw. In the draw step, you get the magnetic attraction to a warm, loving tunnel of light. Now, in the hypnotic regression stuff, which is Cannon and Newton, the draw is moving toward the light, being greeted by deceased loved ones or guides. In the Farsight remote viewing perspective, step 2 is moths to a flame, drawn to an artificial, highly attractive path of false light. Okay. All right, let's move on now to step 3. Beginning with the clinical NDE studies with Moody and Grayson, we can call step 3 the processing. What happens then? You get a rapid educational life review before being sent back to the body. In the hypnotic regression perspective, which is Cannon and Newton, step 3 is processing, meeting with a council of elders to plan the next incarnation's lessons. In the remote viewing part with Farsight, step 3 is processing an intense electroshock, memory wipe, timeline warping, and false memories are implanted. Well, let's go to step 4. Beginning with the clinical NDE studies of Moody and Grayson, let's call step 4 the result. What happens? Well, the soul returns to the body with a profound sense of peace and purpose. With the hypnotic regression, which is Cannon and Newton, step 4, again, the result is the soul eventually accepts reincarnation as a school for spiritual growth. In the Farsight remote viewing perspective, step 4, the result is that the soul is recycled back to earth. Reincarceration, you might call it, being thrown back in jail. The soul is recycled back to earth. Reincarceration as a result of the empty shell with amnesia. Okay? That's the Farsight view of the exact same phenomena. So we're describing the same thing, but we're describing it in a different way. So let's talk about the ultimate convergence. Is the timeline destroyed? Well, despite the grim prison planet nature of the remote viewing data, both hypnotic regression and Farsight's sessions arrive at a surprisingly hopeful conclusion. In her session, Shantae observed that while the timeline of subjects' existences, which in the project was object P, it was warped and bent and obscured by the maintenance machinery, it was not completely destroyed. So it was not completely destroyed. So this directly mirrors the core philosophy of past life regression, that the memories of who we are, where we came from, and our infinite nature as conscious beings are still completely intact. They're just buried beneath the artificial amnesia. And the tangled cords of our past lives can be untangled once we become aware that the system exists. So this whole discussion is based on the whole projects in Farsight that you can see on farsightprime.com of the death traps, the escape, and the maintenance of the death traps. Those 3 projects. It's really great stuff. And now is the time really you want to go and watch those things closely. Again, on farsightprime.com.